talking today with Mr. Richard Astrauckas, who is from Quaker Hill, Connecticut. That's right. And can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself? For instance, where were you born?
I was born in Manchester, Connecticut.
Okay, in what year?
1925.
All right. And what did your family do?
Well, my father was a laborer for a textile mill,
Mm-hmm.
maintenance worker and stuff like that. And my mother worked in a spinning mill and things like that. They'd come from Lithuania originally, and they were the type of people that felt that they were only one class of people, that if I try to expand my horizons, they would discourage it and say our kind of people don't do that and so forth. And I didn't listen to that. And I found the avenue when I left high school, and I went off to sea.
Okay. Now, how old were you when you left high school?
Let's see, I was just starting my junior year, so I was probably about 16. And I went to work for Pratt & Whitney Aircraft. I was a setup man on the lathe and production and so forth. And then when I became 18 years old, because my mother would not sign for me to go into the Navy or anything like that, and I finally had to put it to her that I was going to go into the Merchant Marine, and she had to sign now, or else the government would draft me without a signature.
Okay. Now, did you start at Pratt & Whitney, was that before or after Pearl Harbor?
That was after Pearl Harbor.
And do you remember hearing about Pearl Harbor?
Oh yes, as a matter of fact, Pearl Harbor, I'd gone to a movie at Circle Theater in Manchester, and on my way home, I saw the Hartford Courant, these huge headlines. They were probably almost a foot tall. And Pearl Harbor bombed. I didn't know where Pearl Harbor was. It's probably somebody's hunting for pearls and stuff like that. However, I had about 75 cents or whatever. I bought all these newspapers for 3 cents each. And of course, cars didn't have radios at that time. And I'm standing on the railroad tracks, and as the cars were passing, I'm holding up these headlines, and they'd look at it, they'd open their window, give me 50 cents and drive off without waiting for change. So I was one of the first profiteers of World War II.
All right. So now then, once the war had started, were you paying attention to what was happening in it?
Oh, yeah, oh yes, most definitely. As a matter of fact, I think it was, I was working, I was still going to school, and I was working at the hospital, Manchester Memorial Hospital, in the laundry room, and I had heard that Jimmy Doolittle had taken off and bombed Japan. That's the first I heard of that. And then there was another time I was babysitting for my sister's little girl, and I heard the invasion of Africa on the radio that time, so I remember that very vividly.
Okay. So that's November of 42.
That's right.
All right. And then when did you join the Merchant Marine?
I joined in November of 1943
Okay. Now, why did you pick the Merchant Marine?
because I couldn't get in the Navy. The Navy rejected me.
And why?
And I wanted the sea because I told my mother, if I'm going to die, I don't want to die with dirty socks and muddy socks. I want a nice, clean ship and go down in the water. You know?
All right. And how did you hear about the Merchant Marine?
I don't really know. I think a cousin of mine went into the maritime service. I vaguely heard about that, but I knew it was going to sea, and that was okay. Oh, also, when I was in grammar school, I'd read books on, I forget the author's name, but he wrote a series of books about tramp steamers. And I was really enthralled with the travel and stuff like that. And that was on my mind, too.
All right. Now, where did you report to then once you signed up?
I reported to New Haven, Connecticut, at a recruitment station there, and then when he said, now's the time to go, we're going to go to Hoffman Island for boot camp. It was a boot camp at that time. So I went through boot camp training, and then I started in cook and baker school. And I'd only been in cook and baker school maybe 3 weeks or whatever, and then they said they're going to ship us out. And I figured, well, the reason they're going to ship us out is because they need us on the ships. There's a shortage of seamen. And little did I know that they were going to make this into a radio school. and I didn't know that. No wind of that at all.
Okay. Can you describe the Hoffman Island facility a little bit?
That is rather vague.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the officers' quarters because I was doing some cook and baker experiences there with this wonderful Austrian chef. And one time I was kneading this sweet dough, and I had a watch that my mother had given me when I graduated from grammar school, and I looped it around my little place we put our ties in and our uniforms, and that's the last I saw of it. So somebody bit into time somewhere along the way.
Okay. Now, while you were on Hoffman Island, did you get any chance to go over to New York City or anything like that?
Oh yes, many times. Matter of fact, well, no, that was when I was in radio school, when this plane hit the Empire State Building at that time. Oh yeah, well, actually, most of the time I would go home because it was only a couple-hour train ride.
Right.
Yeah, and we being in a uniform, we got special deals on the trains and so forth. Matter of fact, during the war in New York City, you could ride free on the Staten Island Ferry, no matter what kind of a uniform you had, whether you're a milkman or a post office employee or a fireman or a policeman. But it was only a nickel anyway on the ferry.
Now, when did they ship you out from Hoffman Island then, that first time?
That was in March of 1944, and I went down to Baltimore, and I picked my first ship. Well, I got my first ship, signed up for it in New York, and went to Baltimore to pick it up. And it's amazing because I started my seagoing career in Baltimore in 1948. I ended it in Baltimore, my last ship.
Okay. Now, what kind of ship did they put you on?
Liberty.
All right. And what was it carrying?
Excuse me?
And what was it carrying?
At that time, we're going to go to England, and we were carrying general cargo, which meant the ship could go anywhere. And what we did, we left to Baltimore, and we went to Halifax, Nova Scotia for a convoy, and then over to Loch Hew in Scotland, where we rendezvoused for another convoy to either go to Murmansk. They took some of our complement of our ships and sent them to Murmansk, and us they finally sent around Scotland and down to the Isle of Skye. And then we anchored there for a while, and then they ordered us to the London area, which was on Tilbury docks on the Thames. And when we got there, they unloaded our cargo, and we just sat there for a while.
Let's back up a little bit. What was that first ocean trip like?
It was very harrowing. We ran into 50-foot waves. We lost 2 lifeboats, stove in one of our doors, and water was cascading in, going down a ladder over our ice plant. So we were bailing out water at 2 o'clock in the morning to save our ice plant, because with that we wouldn't have any refrigeration. And it was a pretty bad storm, and we had this one ordinary seaman, Manuel. He was probably 65 years old. He could have sailed as bosun. But he sailed as an ordinary seaman at this time, and I looked at him and I said, "Manuel, is this a bad storm?" He looked at me and he said, "Not too bad." I said, "You don't look worried." "No, why aren't you worried?" "My grandfather, he died at sea. My father, he died at sea. Maybe someday I die at sea." And with that, all fear left me. I had no fear from that moment on with that type of philosophy.
Now, aside from the storm, did you have any U-boat scares, or was it otherwise a quiet trip?
No, of course, when you're in convoy and you're in a storm like that, you lose your position. And you wonder why you never had a collision. And we had no U-boat scares at all at that time, no.
Okay. Well, there weren't too many still out there at that point.
There were some still out there.
There were some.
No question about that.
So the total number of sinkings was way down.
Yeah.
For about a year at that point. Yeah. Okay. Now, so you said you get to England and you sit there.
We sit there, and then finally they came and they made over number 5 hold to sleep 750 troops, sleeping on 3 shifts. And then we had 2 British quartermasters that would take care of the troops and so forth. And we didn't know what we were for, what we were going to do. We're going to go to India, where are we going to go? We had all sorts of
Now,
rumors.
while you were there, did they let you go ashore much and look around?
Oh yeah, oh sure, oh yes. I would go into, we were Tilbury, I'd go to Gravesend, or I'd go to Grays, and sometime up to East Ham and to London. And whatnot. London was about 50 miles away, I think. So we did all that, yeah. And then when we finally got the word that we were going to go, we didn't know we were in an invasion until we were out to sea. Well, we started to head out to Thames, and this was about June 5th, I think, something like that. And then we had to pull into the Isle of Wight because of a storm.
Right.
And then they postponed the invasion at that time, which we know now, which we didn't know then.
Yeah.
And then the next day when we took off for the beachhead, then we were told that we were going to the invasion of Normandy. And we were going through the Straits of Dover. So here you had to go through in columns of ducks because it was all mined. And then you were facing the 16-inch
Coastal guns there. And were the Germans shooting at you as you went by?
Oh yeah, a couple of times. They pick up our barrage balloons that we were flying, pick it up on a radar. And boy, when you got a near miss of these things, your ship would heel over. And of course, the joy of making this trip all the time, I always had the radio on in the officer's mess, and I'd be listening to Glenn Miller.
Let's pause that here
Okay.
and see what. All right.
On these trips to Normandy, we listened to Glenn Miller, who was over there with the Army Air Force Band, and he would have spin-offs like the Ray McKinley Sextet, Johnny Desmond Sings, and all these different kind of things, which was quite a joy to listen to all the time. Took your mind off these things. And many of these trips we also witnessed the V1s as they were coming through. Some of them were coming like mast high and they were misfiring, going into the cliffs, and others you'd see a British Black Widow chasing them and try to tip the V1 to set off the gyro so they would crash into the sea, and all you could see is just the flames coming out of the rear end of the V1s and stuff like that. So they were pretty harrowing too.
Now, the first time you went over to Normandy, was it on D-Day that you got there?
B+1.
B+1. And then where did you actually unload the troops?
Juneau.
Okay. And how did they get ashore?
We were anchored out about 2 miles offshore, and they came in, LCVPs came up. And we had vehicles loaded with supplies and everything. They'd take those and the troops, and they'd ferry them ashore. And this was before the Mulberry was set up.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Now, as you're doing it, I mean, what could you see as you were going back and forth, or how much of a sense did you have of what was going on?
Well, we could see that naturally the battle area at Juneau and Sword was sort of a gradual incline into the hills, and not like the cliffs at Utah or
Omaha in particular.
Yeah, and we could see that the Canadians and the British had made headway almost immediately.
Yeah. Okay. Now, how many of those trips did you make?
We made 7.
Okay. And over what period of time did you make those?
We made them up until August 5th, and then we'd unloaded 750 Canadian troops, and at midnight we got hit by what we considered a human torpedo. Actually not a human torpedo, because it's a two-man torpedo with a saddle. 2 men would drive it up to the ship, set a timing device and swim ashore if they could make it and get themselves up. Naval intelligence said it was an acoustical torpedo, and I said, how the hell can it be an acoustical torpedo when we're at anchor? And it usually follows the sound of the propeller.
Right.
And then the third one was that it was an E-boat. So take your pick. So it hit number 5 hold, and it killed 2 of our British quartermasters that were sleeping down there.
And did the ship itself sink?
No, it did not. We abandoned ship. Matter of fact, when we got hit, it was about 5 o'clock in the morning, and the bunk on top of me came down on top of me. So I didn't even take my glasses. I ran out, and I had in my mind that I could leave my forecastle, make a left-hand turn, how many steps that was, into the first ladder, and how many steps on the ladder up to the boat deck that I could do in the dark. Well, in this confusion, all of a sudden, here I am walking on a splintered deck. I had no clothes, didn't have only my underwear, and I said, "Where the hell is everybody?" And I finally look over the side, and I'm one deck above the boat deck. I went up that ladder so fast, and I saw the chaos that was involved there. The chief mate was in charge of our lifeboat, and I could see that it was on a kilter like this. I said, "Uh-oh." So I decided to go back to my room, put on my clothes, get my glasses, and I had a getaway bag. And in that getaway bag with a long rope, and in that I had chocolate bars, I had cigarettes, I had all my seamen's papers wrapped in a condom to keep them waterproof, and all this kind of stuff in this bag. That was my getaway bag. So I got that, and then by the time I got out there, the boat was in the water, so I went down on the fall and we got in. And we abandoned ship, and we went over to the USS Woodward, which was at anchor pretty close to us. And we stayed there, and then about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the afternoon, they informed us that they needed a skeleton crew to see what can be done to salvage the ship, because we had blown a hole about big enough to put a light heavy tank through one side, a number 5 hole, and a light tank out the other side. And we cracked the bow. Also, we had a crack about 2 inches from the water side across the deck, the port side, and across the starboard side. And she had cracked her bow before I got the ship, when she came back from Murmansk, and was coming out of Belfast running ballast. She cracked her bow, she went back into Belfast, and they welded her back together again, and that's when I got it. And so they figured that they didn't total it right there and then, so I was part of the skeleton crew. Finally, after a few days, and I was down in the engine room one time, and you heard them dropping depth charges around, and whoop, we're down in the engine room, and you're on a dead ship, we have no power, nothing. It's quite a frightening situation. And so they finally decided to take the cargo hatch girders and weld 3 of them on the port side and on the starboard side to hold the ship together. Then he got this huge sea-going tug that they threw this hawser around us. And then as the sea-going tug took up the slack on the hawser, and you heard the screeching of metal, you didn't know whether it was the hawser or the ship, or you're going to wave goodbye to the bow. Finally, they picked up all the slack and they towed us to Southampton. And they beached her just a couple of blocks from where my skipper was born. And of course, he never brought a ship back to the States. This is the 3rd one he lost. And I left it there, and then the stuff that I researched on it, they finally totaled it. And then somewhere after the war, they towed her out to the North Sea, loaded her with German ammunition, and blew her up. That was the legacy of that ship.
Okay. Now, what were your duties on that ship? What had you done?
I was officer's mess at that time. And of course, at that time, because I was part of the skeleton crew, my pay continued. But when I left it in Southampton, my pay stopped. As all the other crewmen, when they left the ship, it stopped. That was it. And I went to Glasgow, Scotland for repatriation. And I was getting something like, I think it was $5 a day every 3 days, $15 to subsidize myself until they provided transportation to send me back. And I received a whole bunch of ration coupons, English ration coupons, that were more than, I would say, the average family would get in a year. And I could have sold them on the black market, but that wasn't my point. And we were staying at a seaman's house and our seaman's club, And this woman who was taking care of us, she had lost her son in the Merchant Navy. So I gave her all these food stamps, and with not food stamps, but with the stamps, a year's supply. They could probably buy a pair of shoes or an overcoat, but not both. So that was the extent of the seriousness of rationing in England at that time. And then I finally got repatriated. I was put on the Mauritania, a new Mauritania. It only made one peacetime run before the war. And I slept in the cocktail lounge. And we had on this ship German prisoners and other people like myself. Spike Jones was on it, and he was coming back after playing on the beaches at D-Day. And he and I had some conversations, and the Commodore of the ship wanted him only to play the first class passengers. And Spike Jones said, "No way, if I can't play for everybody, I don't play at all." And that was it.
Did you see much of the German prisoners, or did they keep them sequestered?
Oh, I saw them. Yeah, there were a few Japanese in there too, because they were just observing German tactics and things like that. And they were captured at Normandy, and they kept the officers and the men separated naturally, as the Germans do. And then I noticed that the British Tommies were pretty severe on them. And I saw one 17-year-old. He went up to one German prisoner who probably said something out of sorts. He just belted him with a rifle butt. They didn't wait for anything.
How did the German prisoners strike you generally? What impression did you have of them?
Well, the only thing I recognized was the total separation of the officers and the men in all aspects. Yeah.
What did the men look like? I mean, how old were they? What kind of shape were they in?
Some of them probably, some of them were middle-aged, because some of them were probably not German at all. That they were either Polish or Lithuanian or Russian or what have you.
All right. Then once you got back to the States, then what happened next?
Well, I was going to take 30 days off, but after hearing how people were complaining about butter, about gas, and all this kind of stuff, I said, I want to get back to sea. At least that makes sense. So after 15 days, I went down to Baltimore, and I signed up for a ship that was in New Orleans. So I went down there, picked up the ship, and it took us 36 days to go from New Orleans to Hollandia, New Guinea. So we anchored in Hollandia, New Guinea sometime in November of 1944, and just lay at anchor there, fully loaded.
What did Hollandia look like?
Well, we never got ashore. All we could see was the shore, and that was it. Matter of fact, it was we'd be swimming in the water there, and guys would get fungus, growths between their toes, behind their necks, and their ears, and everything like that from this humidity and whatnot we're involved in. And matter of fact, some of the guys were making a grog, which they took all the leftovers from breakfast, the things, the potato peelings, the prunes, the orange peels, the lemon peels, and are getting this grog going and putting it in a paint locker to ferment. And oh my God. And then about New Year's Eve of 1944, they finally decided to open it up. That stuff smelled to high heaven. I would not even touch it. But these guys got wild. They shot off to 20 millimeters. And the old man was furious. And the old man, he had a white shirt every day. No kidding, a clean white shirt. And he was really upset. And I was on a flying bridge, and I watched him. He went forward to go to the paint locker, and I said, oh, he's going to find where that stuff was. And he got to finally the paint locker, which was just above toward the forward part, above number 3 hole. And he opened up the dogs, opened up that door, and he stepped back. You could smell the paint. The grog hit him right in the face. And then shortly after that, we went up to the invasion of Luzon.
Okay. And then what did you see on that? What do you remember about that?
we were, again, you're at anchor, and you have these port battalion guys and loading the ship, Army Port Battalion. And the only thing we had was one reconnaissance plane flew over, and it was so high that they were starting to shoot at it, and we said, gee, it's so far out of range, forget it, it's just reconnaissance. And that was it. And I did know that the 43rd Division was there, and they were Connecticut National Guards, but I never got to see them at all. We were near a place called the Goopin.
And were you offloading supplies there? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then once we offloaded, we went back to Hollandia. And of course, during that time is when I was studying radio with the chief radio officer. He made an oscillator for me, which I did code. And then we were studying from a question and answer book, Nelson Hornig. And I was doing radio theory by rote, totally rote.
How did you get started with that?
I always wanted to get to be a telegrapher after seeing Mickey Rooney and some of the old movies and things like that. So that was an impressionable to me, and I thought that'd be real cool.
So you just sort of asked the radio officer to show you how it worked, or?
Oh yeah. They were very, very instrumental and very encouraging, very much so. And then since I only had 2 years of high school, I wrote a letter and received recommendations from the skipper, from the chief radio officer, and I wrote a letter to the commandant of the United States Maritime Service telling about my wishes, what my education was, 2 years of high school, and I mailed it from New Guinea, and 24 days later we're in San Francisco, and there's a letter waiting for me from the United States, the commandant of the United States Maritime Service, and I'm to take this letter to any recruiting office in the United States. They are to request a physical and educational waiver and send me to the radio school of my choice. So this was talking my language. So naturally I chose Hoffman Island because I'd been there through boot camp. And it was amazing because when I got on the Mayfair to go from Staten Island to Hoffman Island, when I got off the Mayfair, I had these officers carry my bags because these officers used to be ship's company when I was there through boot camp, and some of them were second-class stewards or whatever. So they handled everything for me very, very well.
Okay. Now, how well did your letter work? Did you have any problems getting people to give you the waiver for physical and all that kind of thing?
No, the only thing is I went to a recruiting office in Boston, Massachusetts, and they started putting me through a physical. And finally one of the doctors said, what are we doing? Well, the only thing we have to do is request from Washington a physical and educational waiver and send him to the radio school of his choice. Where do you want to go? I said, Hoffman Island.
All right. So then, okay, you get there at Hoffman Island. What kind of training do you get there? What do they do to train a radio officer?
Well, I was only in school. It was a 26-week course. And it was about my 3rd or 4th week. And the war was over. And I was really upset because this is my goal. And one of the officers, the lieutenant commander, he mentioned that Congress cut the appropriations, the school is going to be shut down. But he knew that my code was up, and my experiences and so forth, and he kept me there on an official leave for another week, and I studied and studied and studied, and then went up for my FCC license, and I passed it. And I didn't get an associate, I got a full second-class telegrapher's license.
So how many words per minute could you decode?
I was over 20. I was over 20.
All right. Now then, so basically the idea would have been normally you would have just been sent home or whatever because you weren't far enough into the course, but they made an exception for you to keep you around and give you a chance.
Oh, definitely. There were a few others. I forget who they were, but there were a few others, not many, just a handful of us. And I was so saturated with studying that when I took the Staten Island ferry to go over to New York to sit for my license, I took all my textbooks and I threw them over the side. And then went up for my license and got it.
All right. Now, once you got the license, then what did you do?
Then, at first I was a little reluctant. I didn't have self-confidence at that time. So I took a victory ship and I sailed to Le Havre. We took prisoners, German prisoners, back to Le Havre and things like that. They didn't want to go back because they had been in Texas and they were treated so well by the people that they were working for that they didn't want to go back to Germany, but they had to. And then after that I got my first ship, and Walter Ford, and made a trip from New York to Houston. And that was my first experience in downsizing. By the time I got to Houston, they decided no longer were they going to be carrying 3 radio officers, but only 1. So I was the junior of the juniors. So here I was in Houston. So I flipped the coin. I said, now let's see, where should I go, New York or San Francisco? I had no concept of the distance of either. So San Francisco won. So I went to an ALA club, which was like AAA, and found somebody had a 1941 Mercury who was going to be driving to San Francisco. So I guess for about $20 or something like that, they'd take me as a passenger. I said, okay, here we go. So man, we drove, and there were no super highways in those days, and we got to San Francisco. And I went there, went to the Union Hall, and I saw one of the gentlemen that went for his license with me. And I said, how are things going here? He said, not too good. I said, mean not too good? He said, oh yeah. I said, where'd you go? He says, I went to Fort Mason. I talked to Captain Treadway and nothing. I said, how do you get there? He says, oh, you take the K car down Van Ness Avenue and you go down to Fort Mason. I said, okay. So I went down there and I saw Captain Treadway, and he asked me about my experience as radio officer. I said, nothing. I said, 1 ship. I said, but I know that the only reason of my being on the ship is for the safety of lives on the ship. And if that antenna goes down, it's my job to get this thing back on the air. He hired me right away. I was on per diem and full pay, and didn't even have a ship. So here I was doing code, which they only required me to do a little bit of code, come in every once in a while. And this young man came by. He took a look at me. What are you doing here? I said, do what you told me. Take the K car, get down to Van Ness Avenue, see Captain Treadway. And I did exactly what you told me. And here I am. Oh, he stormed out of there. He went to Captain Treadway's office. He still never got hired. So then I took there was one ship they wanted to decommission. It was called a Puebla. It was originally the Orinoco, which was on a Hamburg, a South American run. And the legend was that she was also on a convoy with the Graf Spee. And then when all this action started, they scuttled her in Mexican waters. And the Mexicans retrieved her because it was kind of shallow there. And they retrieved her, and then the American government was going to lease it, make it into a troop carrier, and use it for the invasion of Japan, which never came. So here we're going to just decommission it, take it down from San Francisco to Mobile, Alabama. And that's what we did with that. And then came back by train to San Francisco, and then I signed up for what was a year's contract to run an inter-island ship in Honolulu, from Honolulu to Hilo. We were carrying Army personnel for R&R. This was 1946. And that was pretty good duty, very good duty. But then I wanted to finish my high school education. And for some reason or other, I was discouraged because they wouldn't take me into Roosevelt High School in Honolulu and McKinley and whatnot. I said, well, I gotta go back home to get my high school. I didn't think of GEDs or anything like that at that time. So I resigned, and after 6 months, and I was waiting for Army transportation, and who the heck knows when it's going to come, because it had to wait for a bride ship coming from Australia with all the war brides and stuff like that. So although I was on full pay and per diem, officers per diem, I saw somebody ran an ad in the Honolulu Advertiser. He had purchased an R4D, which is like a C-47,
Mm-hmm.
and he needed a radio officer to fly it back. He had to have a licensed
Mhm.
radio officer to fly it back. So I said, well, I've never been here before, you know, what the heck? So he explained to me, he said, oh yeah, you know, we're gonna put 2 extra gas tanks in the fuselage and 4 100-gallon drums, you know, no problem. There's 2 engines. I said, oh yeah, I didn't know anything about this.
Mm-hmm.
So we took a trial run around the islands, and I said, I'm gonna get off this crate. but I said, good God, where would he find another nut like me
Mm-hmm.
with a license to fly this thing back? And the guy wants to start an airline.
Right.
So I said, okay, we'll do it. So when we started to take off, we jacked up the tail, tipped off the wing tanks, dropped the tail, and we took off.
Mm-hmm.
And there I am sitting in the co-pilot seat, and I said to him, how do you know we're going to hit California? He said, no problem, it's this big.
Mm-hmm.
I said, ooh. and then he fell asleep,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sitting in the co-pilot seat, and all of a sudden the starboard engine starts coughing out.
Mm-hmm.
And I woke him up, I said, we're losing the starboard engine. Not to worry, I've flown these things on one engine all the way from Goose Bay to Ireland. So then he gets up, and he goes into the fuselage, he turns one of the tanks off and turns another one on, hits the magneto, and we're flying again.
Mm-hmm.
It took us 16 and a half hours to fly to Oakland from Honolulu at that time on these 2 engines.
All right. Then what did you do once you got there?
When I got there, then I went to my high school, and I worked for the Pratt Whitney aircraft that I worked for before. I worked on the third shift and went to school during the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess in something like 8 or 10 weeks, I had enough from my high school diploma.
Now,
And I
were you
graduated.
attending school with? But were you attending with sort of other veterans and older
No,
people, or were you just
no.
attending with high school kids?
With high school kids?
So what was that like?
I don't remember that. I just did what I had to do and go to work and stuff like that. There wasn't much thought about that. Yeah.
All right. So then, when did you finish high school?
That was in I think 1946.
Okay. And then, what did you do next?
Then I went back to sea
Mm-hmm.
because I was getting disgusted with all my buddies that were war veterans that were at a 52-20 club, and since they were getting $20 a week for 52 weeks,
Mhm.
why should I go looking for a job?
Right.
And that sort of discouraged me. I said,
Mhm.
this isn't my thing, I'm gonna get the hell out of here. So I went back to sea, and I went to the Brooklyn Army base, and I started sailing on an Army transport ship again,
Mhm.
and we had a ship called the Belle Isle, which was a Newfoundland ship originally. And we took that ship up to St. John's, Newfoundland. It was like a homecoming,
Mm-hmm.
because here's our ship coming back. And then we went up to Greenland, and we were ferrying engineers from Greenland over to Baffinland and Labrador for about 6 months and stuff
So
like
what
that.
was that experience like, sailing up around the Arctic?
Oh, that was quite a bit, because we'd go to BW1 and BW2, which was up above the Arctic Circle,
Mhm.
and that was quite interesting, yeah. And there you were getting almost 24 hours of daylight.
Mm-hmm.
You would get about dusk at 2 o'clock, and then the sun would rise at 5,
Mm-hmm.
and that was it, yeah. But it wasn't bad going to the officers' club. Whiskey was only 15 cents a shot.
Mm-hmm.
And the ship psychiatrist and I were always buddies, and we'd always go there.
The ship had a psychiatrist?
Yeah, we had a psychiatrist, yeah.
Was that...
He and I used to play chess, and every once in a while I distinctly remember him trying to psychoanalyze me while we were playing chess, but he could never beat me.
I'd never heard of the ship having its own psychiatrist
Yeah,
before.
we did.
Was he just a doctor who happened to be a psychiatrist? Or?
Probably so, you're probably right, because he was a nut just like me. We'd go to the officers' club, and a new Army officer would introduce himself to us, just came in. So we'd have our drinks in front of us, we'd walk around him and do these, This guy's like, who are these guys?
So after that tour, then what did you do?
Then I left the Army Transportation Service, because our trip was over finally, and I went to work for the American Hawaiian Lines, which my first two ships were American Hawaiian, and this Greek outfit bought this Liberty ship, and they had several Greek ships, Liberian ships, Canadian ships, and this was their only American flagship, and they renamed it the Coral Sea. So I spent a year on that, and we used to do a run about 3 times a year to Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Bremen, Bremerhaven, and Hamburg, which was a really, really nice run. And of course, I liked Hamburg especially because it was British sector. And the British Tommies weren't as strict as our American soldiers. You had to come up with a bigger bribe to our American soldiers to get anything done with cigarettes. And then I took a trip off because the ship went to Ireland. I didn't want to go to Ireland. Then I got back on it, and the last trip I made, we were running Marshall Plan grain to Crete. They were starving there. The Civil War was still on in Greece. In Greece at that time, this was 1948. And however, in the mainland, the communists were being pushed up toward Albania, and on the island of Crete, they were up in the mountains. And there was hardly any activity there. The only thing they would do was to steal a bus going from Arakalon to Kanya, and they would steal a bus, not harm any of the passengers, but they take the bus up into the mountains to live in for shelter and things like that. And then we had to unload the grain by hand, which means that they had to shovel it into burlap sacks, truss it up, put it in cargo nets, hoist it up over the deck and down to the dock. And on the deck and on the dock were 2 little old ladies with straw brooms, that every particle of grain that spilled out of those sacks, they retrieved and put it into a sack for the common good, not in their own little pockets, but for the common good. They were all starving at that time. Matter of fact, I went to Greece a number of years ago, and we were in Mykonos, and this waiter was asking me how I enjoyed the trip. I said, well, gee, I haven't been here since 1948. And I told him what I did then. He says, thank you. We were starving. And of course, in Athens is the only place I've ever been out of this country that has a statue of Harry Truman because of all this Marshall Plan stuff that we did and rejuvenated Greece at that time.
And just how long did it take to unload the ship?
It was a couple of months.
And who was doing the unloading? Were there Greek laborers or?
Greek. Oh yeah, because if there was a problem in number 5 hold, and are trying to solve that problem, then the work stopped in number 1 and 2 hold, so everybody could get in and solve this one problem in number 5 hold. That's the Greek way.
I guess so. All right. Now, what made you decide to leave the Merchant Marine?
The reason I decided to leave the Merchant Marine, how many officers, skippers, chief mates, chief engineers have I talked to that I would say to them, and they were married, or of course, I would simply say to them, how many years have you been saying that you're going to leave the sea? Well, I've been saying it for 20 years. I've been saying it for 30 years. I said, but for the grace of God, there go I. And then I felt that at least 7/8 of my time was spent either at sea or in foreign ports of the year. And I figured if I were going to get married, which I had no intention at that time, nothing concrete, that this certainly would not be a family way of life in my estimation. So I figured it's less like a romance. If you want to cut it, you cut it cleanly and say goodbye, and that's it. That's what I did.
All right, and then when you get back to the States, then what did you do?
Then I went to work for Singer Sewing Machine Company.
And how did you wind up with that job?
Well, I asked an ad in the paper, and I wanted to get started in something, and that looked pretty good. So I started out. I think I applied for a job as a mail clerk, whatever. And when I saw what I could do, that was no good. They put me on a desk job, and then I started to become a traveling auditor with them. I started traveling around auditing stores, and things like that. And I was doing that for a number of years, and then 1950, I got drafted into the Army for the Korean War. And I went through basic training there, and actually, when I finished basic training, the company commander says, "We're gonna give you a promotion from recruit to private."
Mm-hmm.
I said, "Thank you, sir, but I refuse the promotion." And he looked at me. He said, "Why?" I said, "Well, I don't need the money. And number two, the Army's not my career."
Mm-hmm.
And then I felt after a couple of days, so what am I doing to this poor guy?
Mm-hmm.
So I went to him and I finally said, he's got to answer for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I finally said, "Look, I'll take the promotion." And then things were happening with my section. They were all being shipped out. Some were going to the adjutant general's office and whatnot. A lot of them had pre-law and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, nothing is happening to me. Therefore, I got to make something happen. So I went up to classification and assignment, and I saw this Captain Brown. And he said, "What do you want?" I said, "I don't know. I want to know what's going to happen to me." "Well, what are your qualifications?" So I told him. So he told the sergeant, "Bring in his military jacket." So he brought in the jacket, and he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, I want to go into Army security. I wanted that like I wanted to hold a head.
Mm-hmm.
Because you had to sign up for another 5 years or something, whatever it was. So all of a sudden the sergeant comes in, he says, "Sir, he can't get into Army security." I said, "Why?" And the captain looks at me, he says, "You're first generation American, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, I am." "Your parents were born in Lithuania." He said, "That's right." "You can't get in." I said, "What do you mean? This is only a police action. This isn't even a war."
Mm-hmm.
He says, "I don't make the laws. Congress makes the laws." And I said, you know, during the war, they had the OSS. They had every pimp, every whore, guys working two ends against the middle. They were happy to have them. And this is only a police action. "Look, what else would you like to go?" I said, "Now you're talking my story.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go to Hoffman Island Radio School."
Mm-hmm.
Not Hoffman Island, Fort Monmouth.
Mm-hmm.
Fort Monmouth. So he said, "Sergeant, put this man on the Fort Monmouth quota." Sergeant goes back running in. "Sorry, sir, Fort Monmouth quota is filled." "What else would you like to do?" he says to me. I said, "Give me a suggestion." He said, "How would you like to go to Camp Gordon?" I said, "Where the hell is that?" He says, "Georgia." I said, "Put me in the infantry."
Mm-hmm.
He says, "Sergeant, put this man on the Fort Monmouth quota, let him pick the school of his choice when he gets there, that's it."
Mm-hmm.
So I went there, and I went through the basic radio school there, and then I ended up as an instructor. I was teaching radio relay systems.
Mm-hmm.
We were get rid of the wire between the telephone and telegraph carrier bays, and replacing it with FM radios. I was teaching the theory of the bays, theory of the teletypewriter, theory of the FM radios, and then bugging them and repairing them and all this kind of stuff. And I didn't find out until I was getting discharged that somebody had put me on detached service to the Signal Corps.
Mm-hmm.
I could never be shipped out. So I spent my entire Army career there.
So what years did that span?
That was 1950, 1952.
All right. So
And then I was going to, I wanted to go to MIT. And at that time, you didn't have to take an entrance exam. You had to have a sponsor. So at Emhart in Hartford was an engineer, was an MIT graduate. So he interviewed me, and everything was going along fine. He says, however, he says, your math is rather deficient. So you should go to UConn for a year. Well, I had to take an entrance exam to UConn. Didn't have to take it for MIT, but for UConn, yeah, I had to take one. And then I'm starting to figure out, my God, how the hell am I going to be able to afford this? It cost $1,800 a year to go to MIT. I'm only getting $800 or something from the GI Bill. And my parents are certainly not going to help me. They're not even encouraging me, never mind financial support. So then when I got discharged from the Army, and I was supposed to report to UConn the next day, I didn't. And that weekend I met my wife. So after 53 years, no regrets.
So did you go back and work for Singer, or what?
I went back to work for Singer, yeah. And however, I decided I'd better switch from auditing because it would be taking me away from the family if I have a family. So I went into sales, and I was really struggling in that. And finally, I got my wife. I was sent down to New London, Connecticut. I want to see what this guy was doing, and I found out that he was lying and cheating.
Mm-hmm.
And when I questioned him about it, I said, when somebody exposes you in a lie, what do? You say, I tell the same lie.
Mm-hmm.
I says, you have the same philosophy Adolf Hitler did, You tell the same lie over and over again, it becomes the truth. I said, well, if you have that strength of convictions, and if I have the strength of convictions in the opposite tone, then I can be equally successful.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what happened.
So what does that translate to in terms of what you did next?
Well, I stayed with Singer, and they wanted to ship me off to Claremont, New Hampshire, and I said, no way. We love the shore.
Mm-hmm.
This is where we're staying. Then I went into the insurance business for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I was there for a couple of years, and then left that and went to work for Southern Wing Telephone Company in advertising, Yellow Pages. And I spent the rest of my career there. So I was 38 years old when I went to work for the telephone company.
Mm-hmm. Takes you about as long to get started as a lot of
And,
other
and,
things.
and the only reason I got to work for them, the job called for a 2-year college education.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was in the Army, I took batteries of tests with the United States Armed Forces Institute,
Right.
and I got 36 college credits with all these batteries of tests that I had taken. So I used that as my 2 years of high school, or of the college. Yeah.
Right. To look back on it all, how do you think that your time in the Merchant Marine wound up affecting you sort of as a person? Did it change you in any way? Or?
It gave me self-confidence, and it inspired me, because a lot of these people that I came across, skippers and chief engineers, had no more of an education than I did. They took themselves up by their own bootstraps, and they studied, they read well, and so forth, very, very well informed. And I said, if they can do it, I can do it too, in my own little way.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you very much for talking to me.
You're welcome.
Fishing interview.